There is a particular quality to silence that has lasted 3,000 years. It is not like the silence of an empty room, or the silence that follows a conversation. It is deeper than that, slower, more settled, the way a stone is settled into riverbed. This is a story that begins in exactly that kind of silence, on a shelf in a house in a city that no longer exists, on the coast of what we now call Syria. Welcome to Candlelit History. Tonight we are reading old letters. Sit comfortably. Let the darkness around you be easy. If you fall asleep before we reach the end of this chapter, or the end of this episode, that is entirely as it should be. This story has been waiting more than 3,000 years to be heard. It will wait a little longer. Let the words come and go like the sound of a distant shore, and take from them whatever your resting mind finds restful. For those who stay awake a while, here is where we are going. Sometime around the year 1185 BC, give or take a decade, as scholars must always say with dates this old, a man named Urtenu lived in the city of Ugarit, on a stretch of Syrian coastline where the Mediterranean catches the last long light of afternoon and turns it the color of hammered copper. Ugarit was, by the standards of its age, a remarkable place, a port city of perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 people, sitting at the intersection of trade routes that connected Egypt and Mesopotamia, the Aegean and the highlands of Anatolia. It was a city of warehouses and scribes, of merchant ships and palace officials, of cedar timber and dried fish and jars of wine moving in and out on the salt wind. Urtenu was a man of some standing in this city. A merchant, a senior official, a keeper of records. On the upper floor of his house, he maintained his correspondence with the careful attention of a man who understood that a letter, properly stored, was a form of wealth. He had letters from Hittite kings. He had records of shipments, tin and bronze and grain, the currencies of a world built on exchange. He had messages from neighbors asking for help, from trading partners confirming arrangements, from officials communicating the business of an empire. All of it stacked and ordered, as a methodical man stacks and orders the things that matter to him. And then, at some point in those final years of the 12th century BC, Urtenu left his house and did not come back. We do not know why. We do not know whether he fled, or died elsewhere, or simply could not return. We know only what happened after. The upper floor of his house, robbed of maintenance and the weight of daily life, slowly gave way under its own heaviness. The ceiling came down, the room filled with rubble, and the tablets, all those letters from kings and merchants and hungry neighbors, were buried where they lay, still in the rough order in which Urtenu had arranged them, still waiting on the positions they had occupied on his shelves. They waited there for 3,170 years, more or less. In 1986, archaeologists working at the site of Ras Shamra, the low, unremarkable hill on the Syrian coast that covers the remains of ancient Ugarit, broke through into that collapsed room. What they found, according to the account preserved in Archaeology magazine's July-August 2021 feature on the Ugarit archives, was a dense concentration of clay tablets lying in the debris of a fallen upper floor. Over subsequent excavation seasons, the French-Syrian archaeological mission would recover some 650 tablets from this single space. It is the largest private archive yet found at Ugarit. Scholars believe it is the archive of Urtenu himself, recovered from the house where he left it. By 2021, roughly 130 of those tablets had been fully published and translated. Up to 100 more were still awaiting complete decipherment. In a very real sense, Urtenu's mail is still being opened. This episode is about what those letters contain and what they belong to. A world so thoroughly connected, so dependent on the movement of ships and the exchange of messages, that when it began to come apart, the unraveling was visible in the correspondence itself, in requests that grew more urgent, in grain shipments that grew less reliable, in letters that were written and eventually never answered. The world of the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, the world that Ugarit inhabited so fully and so productively, is one of the most remarkable things human beings had yet built, in the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era. It stretched from the Nile Delta to the mountains of Anatolia, from the island of Cyprus to the rivers of Mesopotamia, and it was held together not by a single empire, but by something stranger and more fragile, a shared habit of exchange. Palaces trading with palaces, scribes writing in each other's languages, ships following routes so well established that the merchants who sailed them would have known the smell of each harbor before they saw its walls. And then, around 1200 BC, something happened. The palace at Ugarit burned and was never rebuilt. The Hittite Empire, which had been one of the great powers of the age, collapsed with a swiftness that still puzzles historians. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece fell silent. The administrative script they had used, the one scholars now call Linear B, vanished from the record, along with the palace economies that had needed it. Across the eastern Mediterranean, city after city seems to have been abandoned, destroyed, or simply emptied of the complex social machinery that had made it what it was. We call this the Bronze Age collapse. We have been trying to understand it for a century, and this is the honest truth of where scholarship currently stands. We still cannot fully agree on what caused it, or even, as we will see later in this episode, precisely how widespread or how sudden the collapse actually was. New archaeological work published as recently as 2023 has asked uncomfortable questions about how much of the catastrophe narrative rests on solid excavation evidence, and how much rests on assumptions that scholars built carefully on top of other assumptions, generation after generation, until the structure looked more solid than it was. We are not here tonight to offer you a clean answer because the evidence does not offer one. What we can offer is something perhaps more valuable. The letters themselves, read slowly, in the order that makes their weight felt. A weight that has nothing to do with apocalypse and everything to do with the specific human texture of a world under strain. The story begins on a shelf, in a house, in a city on the Syrian coast. It begins with a man who expected to return and did not. And it asks, with all the patience that 3,000 years deserves, what happened to the world he left behind. Settle in. There is no hurry here. The tablets have already waited longer than we can properly imagine. To understand what the last letters of Ugarit were saying, we must first understand the world in which they were written. And that world, when you sit with it quietly for a moment, is a genuinely remarkable thing. Picture the eastern Mediterranean sometime around 1250 BC, not as a collection of ruins waiting to be discovered, but as a living, breathing system of exchange. Cedar timber, freshly cut from the slopes of Lebanon, being shouldered down to the docks at Byblos and loaded onto ships whose hulls rode low in the water under the weight of it. The smell of the wood would have been sharp and sweet on the harbor air. The scribes on the quayside would have been counting, recording, pressing their styluses into soft clay. How many logs? To which destination? Sent by whose authority? To be paid for with what? Every transaction leaving its trace in a medium that, as it turned out, would outlast almost everything else from that world. Those ships did not travel alone into empty seas. They moved along routes that had been worn smooth by centuries of use, stopping at ports whose names read like a roll call of the ancient world: Byblos, Ugarit, and Komi on Cyprus, harbors on the Aegean coast of Anatolia, the great delta ports of Egypt. The cargoes they carried tell a story in themselves. Copper ingots from Cyprus, cast in the shape of an outstretched hide, the so-called oxhide ingots that archaeologists have found scattered across the Mediterranean floor and in the warehouses of a dozen cities. Tin from sources as distant as Afghanistan, moving westward through Mesopotamia and down the Syrian coast before being combined with that Cypriot copper to make the bronze that gave this whole age its name. Glass, ivory, lapis lazuli, wine sealed in Canaanite jars, bolts of linen dyed with the labor-intensive purple extracted from murex shells on the very shores we are describing. This was not subsistence trade. This was something that looked, from a certain angle, recognizably like international commerce, and it was governed, as international commerce tends to be, by correspondence. The great royal archives of the late Bronze Age, Amarna in Egypt, Hattusa in Anatolia, the Palace of Ugarit, preserve hundreds of letters exchanged between kings who called one another brother, and wrote in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the age, regardless of what language they spoke at home. The Egyptian pharaoh wrote to the Hittite king. The Hittite king wrote to the king of Babylon. The king of Babylon wrote to inquire, with barely concealed irritation, why the last gift of gold had been so disappointing in weight. These were not merely polite exchanges. They were the connective tissue of a system. Requests for physicians, complaints about delayed shipments, negotiations over marriages and hostages and treaty obligations, the endless maintenance of relationships on which the movement of goods and armies depended. Ugarit sat at the center of this web with a particular kind of importance. The city occupied a position on the northern Syrian coast, modern Ras Shamra near Latakia, that made it one of the most convenient points of transfer between the maritime routes of the Mediterranean and the overland routes leading east toward Mesopotamia. Its population, which scholars estimate at perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 people, was a mixture that reflected its position. Canaanites formed the core community, but among them lived Hurrians from the north, Egyptians, Cypriots, and Aegean merchants, whose presence is recorded in the tablets and attested by the pottery they left behind. The city's scribes worked in at least 7 languages: Ugaritic, Akkadian, Hurrian, Sumerian, Cypro-Minoan, Hittite, and Egyptian. A fact that still, in an age of professional translation software, has a quality of quiet astonishment about it. A scribe in Ugarit who served the palace and the great merchant houses might spend his working life moving between scripts as a musician moves between registers, each one the appropriate instrument for a different interlocutor. The great powers pressed close on every side. To the north, the Hittite Empire held Anatolia and regarded Ugarit as a vassal state, obligated to provide tribute and military support, but also protected by the enormous prestige of the Hittite crown. Yoram Cohen's work on the Urtenu archive makes clear how deeply that relationship ran. Ugarit's late correspondence is saturated with references to Hittite authority, Hittite demands, and Hittite expectations of loyalty. To the south, Egypt under the great pharaohs of the 19th dynasty had extended its influence deep into Canaan, and the memory of more direct Egyptian control over Ugarit lingered in the diplomatic forms and protocols the city used. To the east, the kingdoms of Assyria and Babylonia were correspondents and trading partners, their merchants appearing in the Ugaritic tablets as creditors, customers, and occasional litigants in the city's commercial courts. What held all of this together was not military force, though force was never far away. What held it together was the shared assumption that the system would continue, that the ships would keep coming, that the correspondence would keep moving, that a letter sent would receive a reply. The Archaeology magazine account of the Urtenu archive describes tablets that range across royal correspondence, diplomatic letters, and commercial records, all gathered in a single wealthy household, all pointing outward toward a network that stretched from Cyprus to the Hittite heartland. A merchant in Ugarit might have business connections in a dozen cities simultaneously. His archive would have been, in miniature, a map of the world. Every clay tablet a line drawn between one place and another, the whole collection forming something like a picture of the web that connected them. This interconnectedness was the defining feature of the late Bronze Age world, and it was, as we will come to understand in later chapters, also its peculiar vulnerability. But that recognition belongs to another part of the story. For now, the point to hold gently in mind is simply this. The world that ended around 1200 BC was not a loose scattering of isolated kingdoms who happened to share a coastline. It was something genuinely more integrated than that, a system of trade and diplomacy and mutual dependence that had been functioning, deepening, and elaborating itself for the better part of 2 centuries. The silence that fell across this world was not the silence of places that had never spoken. It was the silence of letters going unanswered, of merchants waiting for ships that did not arrive, of scribes who had spent their lives writing in 7 languages, finding, one quiet season, that there was no one left to write to. That silence, and how it came to fall, is what this story is here to sit with. In the late summer of 1986, a team of archaeologists working at Ras Shamra, the low, dusty tell on the Syrian coast that covers the bones of ancient Ugarit, moved their trench into the remains of a large private house in the southern quarter of the city. They had worked this site before. Ras Shamra had been under careful excavation, with interruptions, since 1929, and its archaeologists had grown accustomed to the particular texture of Ugaritic destruction. Rooms sealed by collapse, objects left where they had been set down, the quality of abandonment that distinguishes a city that burned from one that was merely deserted. But what they found in that house in 1986 was something they had not encountered before. Not a single tablet or a small cache, but a dense, close-packed concentration of clay lying in the rubble of a fallen upper floor, tablet pressed against tablet in the cool darkness beneath the debris. They had found an archive. Over the seasons that followed, as the French-Syrian mission continued its careful work under the direction of a team that would grow in both size and ambition, the full extent of the find became clear. Some 650 tablets would eventually be recovered from that single room, or rather, from beneath it, since the tablets had originally rested on the upper floor of the house and had tumbled down, along with the beams and plaster of the ceiling, when the structure finally gave way. The fall had been their preservation. Buried under rubble, sealed from air and moisture and the slow depredations of time, the tablets had waited in near-perfect darkness for more than 3,000 years. They were found, in many cases, still lying in rough thematic groupings, clusters of similar documents that suggested they had once been organized on shelves, or gathered into baskets, or tied in bundles according to some logic that their owner had understood, and that the archaeologists could only begin to infer from what remained. The house, as the scholars who studied it gradually determined, had belonged to a man named Urtenu. He was, by every indication the archive provides, a person of considerable standing in the final decades of Ugarit's existence, a senior official with connections to the royal court, and a merchant of significant reach, his correspondence spanning the courts and counting houses of the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. He wrote to kings and received letters from them. He tracked shipments of tin and bronze and grain across the eastern Mediterranean. He kept copies of diplomatic correspondence that touched the highest levels of the Hittite imperial system, of which Ugarit was, in its final years, a vassal state. That a private individual should have accumulated such a collection is itself remarkable. That the collection survived is something closer to astonishing. The Archaeology magazine feature published in the summer of 2021 lingers on the physical experience of encountering the archive. And it is worth lingering here too, because there is something in the material fact of the discovery that no summary can quite convey. Imagine the archaeologist's brush moving across the surface of the rubble, and beneath it, the first curved edge of a fired clay tablet coming into light, and then another, and another beside it, oriented at a slight angle, as though it had slipped from its neighbor's side during the long fall from the floor above. The tablets were not scattered randomly. They had fallen together in something like the order in which they had rested, and the rubble had fixed them there, a frozen inventory of a life interrupted. Some still bore traces of the organic materials, wood, reed, perhaps linen, that had once held them in place. Others had landed face down, their inscriptions protected from the weight of the debris by the luck of their orientation. By 2021, roughly 130 of those 650 tablets had been fully published and made available to scholars. The pace of publication is not a sign of negligence. Cuneiform tablets require painstaking work to read, photograph, transliterate, translate, and annotate, and the scholars who undertake this work do so with a care proportionate to the irreplaceability of what they are handling. But it does mean something worth sitting with quietly, that even now, in the 21st century, Urtenu's correspondence is still being read for the first time. There are men and women alive today who will be the first human beings, since Urtenu himself, to read certain of his letters. Scholars estimate that up to 100 additional tablets from the archive may still await full decipherment. The last letters of the Bronze Age are, in a real and unhurried sense, still arriving. It was the scholar Yoram Cohen, working with the letters that had been published by the time of his study, who drew attention to a cluster within the archive that stands apart from the rest in the quality of its feeling. Cohen's paper, published through Tel Aviv University and drawing on the primary publication series of the Ras Shamra Ugarit volumes, identified a remarkable concentration of letters in which the subject is not trade, not diplomacy, not the routine correspondence of a well-connected official, but hunger, famine, the kind of need that strips language of its diplomatic courtesies and leaves something rawer underneath. These are letters written by people who were frightened, addressed to people who might, if they were willing and able, do something to help. They speak of grain that has not arrived, of populations that cannot be fed, of requests that have already been made once and are now being made again, with greater urgency, in the dwindling hope that this time the ships will come. Cohen's work established that these hunger letters were not isolated complaints, but evidence of a systemic strain affecting Ugarit and the wider region in the city's final years. A strain that, as he carefully documented, predated whatever violent end Ugarit eventually met. The city was already under pressure. The connections that had sustained it, the grain routes from Egypt and the Levant, the trading networks that moved copper from Cyprus and tin from further east, the correspondence chains that linked Ugarit to the Hittite heartland and the courts of Canaan, were already fraying, already slowing, already failing to deliver what they had once delivered with something like reliable ease. The Archive of Urtenu, read in this light, is not simply the record of a prosperous merchant's career. It is a document of a world in the early stages of coming undone, seen from the inside, by the people living through it. There is something in this that goes beyond what any single source can tell us, and it is worth naming carefully. Urtenu kept his archive in order. He organized his tablets by theme. He preserved letters from kings alongside records of commercial transactions, personal messages alongside diplomatic correspondence, as though all of it belonged to a single coherent account of a life being lived in full. The care of that organization speaks to a man who expected to continue, who stacked his letters as a person stacks letters when they plan to return and read them again. The archive is so large and so carefully kept that its abandonment is not immediately legible from the outside. It requires the hunger letters to make it visible, the evidence, quiet and insistent, that something was wrong long before the archive went dark. What Urtenu himself knew of his situation, what he feared or hoped for in those final years, we cannot say with certainty. The tablets do not tell us his inner life. They tell us his correspondence, which is a different and more guarded thing. But the archive as a whole, 650 tablets lying in the rubble of a collapsed floor in a house on the Syrian coast, offers something rare and valuable in the study of ancient history, a human scale. Not a king's proclamation carved in stone for posterity, not a temple inscription written to outlast the dynasty that commissioned it, but the working papers of a man who had business to conduct and letters to answer and, at some point in the years around 1185 BC, found himself unable to do either. The tablets sat where they fell. The floor lay where it had collapsed. And 3,000 years passed before anyone came to read what he had left behind. Among the 650 tablets that Urtenu left behind on his shelves, there is a cluster that scholars have come to call, with quiet precision, the Hunger Letters. They are not the most diplomatically significant documents in the archive. They carry no royal seals, no sweeping declarations of alliance between great powers. They are, in the plain language of what they describe, letters about food, or rather, about the absence of it. And it is perhaps because of that plainness, that bodily directness, that they sit with such weight in the hands of anyone who reads them now. Yoram Cohen, in his analysis of the recently published letters from the Urtenu archive, identifies multiple documents in which correspondents describe conditions of severe food shortage affecting not only Ugarit itself, but the wider region. The Hittite heartland to the north, the territories along the Syrian coast, the dependent towns and smaller settlements that had long looked to Ugarit as a center of distribution. The letters range in tone from the formally urgent to something closer to raw. They are written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the late Bronze Age world, a language whose cuneiform signs were pressed into clay by trained scribes. But beneath the conventions of scribal formality, something else comes through, a quality of need that the formal register cannot entirely contain. One letter in Cohen's analysis asks for grain to be sent quickly. The repetition is not accidental. In the conventions of late Bronze Age diplomatic correspondence, a word repeated in immediate succession carried a recognized weight. It was a way of saying, "This is not a routine request. This cannot wait. This is the kind of urgency that does not observe the usual courtesies of timing." That the word chosen was quickly, and that it was written twice, tells us something the rest of the letter's formal phrasing holds back. Across 3,000 years of translation, from cuneiform to scholarly transliteration, from Akkadian to the English word you are hearing now, that repetition still carries what it was always meant to carry, a quality of fear, a voice asking not to be kept waiting. To understand why these letters were being written at all, it helps to recall something about the world in which Ugarit existed. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was not a collection of self-sufficient agricultural states. It was a system, genuinely interdependent, built on the movement of commodities across long distances in quantities that no single region could produce alone. Grain was one of the most important of those commodities, and its movement followed well-established routes. From the great agricultural surpluses of Egypt and the Levantine coastal plains northward and westward, into the palace economies of Anatolia and the Aegean, which fed their urban populations and their craft workers and their palace administrators on imported food in quantities that their own hinterlands could not reliably supply. The Hittite Empire, whose capital at Hattusa sat on the high Anatolian plateau where the growing season was short and uncertain, was particularly dependent on grain imports. There is evidence, even before the final crisis of the late 13th century BC, that the Hittite kings wrote to Egypt requesting grain in terms that made the stakes plain. What Cohen's hunger letters show is that by the years immediately preceding Ugarit's abandonment, in the early decades of the 12th century BC, this dependency had become a vulnerability, and the vulnerability had become acute. The grain was not arriving in the quantities that the region required. The letters asking for it were multiplying, and the system that had always, eventually, corrected such shortages was showing signs that it could no longer reliably do so. What caused the interruption is a question that, in keeping with the honest position of current scholarship, does not have a clean single answer. Paleoclimatic data drawn from lake sediments and pollen cores across the eastern Mediterranean does show a real period of reduced rainfall centered roughly on the decades around 1200 to 1150 BC. A drought or a series of droughts that would have placed genuine pressure on agricultural yields across the region. Whether that drought was severe enough and consistent enough to account for the scale of shortage described in the hunger letters is a question scholars continue to examine, and the evidence is geographically uneven enough that caution is warranted. What the letters themselves tell us is not a climatic record, but a human one. That people in positions of responsibility, writing to other people in positions of responsibility, felt the shortage keenly enough to commit their fear to clay and send it across the sea. there is something else worth holding alongside the drought. The Late Bronze Age world system was not simply an agricultural network. It was a correspondence network, a diplomatic network, a web of obligations and expectations that kept the grain moving in part because the relationships that had been built across generations of exchange created the trust and the infrastructure to sustain it. When states began to fail, when palace economies contracted or collapsed, when the administrative apparatus that organized grain exports lost its funding or its personnel or its political stability, the effect was not merely local. A state that could no longer export grain did not simply subtract its contribution from the regional supply. It also subtracted its participation from the network of communication and mutual obligation that had made the whole system legible and operable. The disruption was not only agricultural. It was, in a quiet but profound way, epistolary. Cohen's analysis notes that the hunger described in the Urtenu letters was regional. The letters speak not only of Ugarit's own distress, but of conditions across the Hittite sphere and the wider Syrian coast. This is not a city reporting a local bad harvest. It is a correspondence network reporting a regional crisis, in the only language available to it. Letters asking for grain, letters describing conditions, letters sent along the routes that had always, before, connected the hungry to those who could help them. It is worth being precise about what these letters are and are not. They are documented, recoverable, translated evidence of food shortage in Ugarit's final years. They are not, by themselves, a theory of the Bronze Age collapse. The chapter does not ask them to carry more than they can hold. Famine alone has never been the accepted single cause of the collapse, and the careful scholarship on this question is careful for good reason. Any single-cause explanation for an event this large and this complex will always be an oversimplification. What the hunger letters offer is not an explanation but a texture, the bodily, specific human texture of what it felt like to be living inside the system as it slowed. Because that is what these letters are, finally. They are not letters from the moment of catastrophe. They are letters from the years before, the hungry years, as Cohen calls them, when the catastrophe was still, perhaps something that might be forestalled if the grain arrived quickly enough, if the ships came in time, if the reply to the letter reached them before the situation worsened. The people who wrote these letters had not given up on the system. They were still using it. They were still pressing their styluses into clay and trusting that the old roots held, that the old obligations remained, that somewhere beyond the horizon there was a storehouse and a willing correspondent and a ship that would set sail. They were people who were hungry, writing to people who might help, and they were waiting, as the archives show, and as the silence that follows them confirms, for ships that were increasingly slow to arrive. There is one document that sits at the center of every serious account of the Bronze Age collapse, and this chapter belongs entirely to it. Not to the theories that surround it. Not to the century of scholarship that has interpreted it. Not even for now, to the question of what it means. This chapter belongs to the letter itself, to the words on the clay, to the specific and irreducible fact of what one king wrote to another king in the last years of a world. The document is known by its excavation number, RS 18.147. RS for Ras Shamra, the modern tell under which ancient Ugarit sleeps. The number places it in the sequence of finds recovered from the site, catalogued with the patient precision that archaeology demands. It was first published in full in 1968 in Ugaritica 5, a volume produced by the French Archaeological Mission and edited by Jean Nougayrol and his colleagues, which remains the standard scholarly edition of the text. In the citations and footnotes of every subsequent serious treatment of the Bronze Age collapse, Ugaritica 5, number 24, is where the trail leads back. The letter was written by Ammurapi, the last known king of Ugarit. It is addressed to the king of Wallachia, a place which most scholars today identify with reasonable confidence as the island of Cyprus. The date assigned to it is approximate, as dates from this period must be, sometime around 1185 BC, give or take a few years in either direction. We are working, as we always are in this corner of history, with chronologies built from overlapping evidence and honest inference, rather than from the clean certainty of a dated inscription. The letter was found at Ugarit itself. That detail deserves a moment of quiet attention. A letter addressed to the king of Cyprus, found not in Cyprus, but in Ugarit, in the city from which it was written, which means it was never sent, or that if it was sent, it was somehow returned, or that it was a draft, a copy kept for the archive, a record of a plea that may or may not have crossed the water. We do not know. The scholarship of Ugaritica 5 and the subsequent literature can tell us the text. It cannot tell us the journey, or whether the journey was ever made. We hold that uncertainty here, and we do not fill it with invention. What we do know is the text. And so, with the care that a primary source deserves, this is what it says. The standard scholarly translation, following Ugaritica 5 and the versions cited in the academic literature on Ammurapi, runs something like this. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the Hittite country, and all my ships are in the land of Lycia? Thus, the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. Now, if there are more enemy ships, tell me about them so that I can know. That is the letter. Not long, not ornate. The language of a man who has run out of anything but the plainest words. Let us sit with it. The enemy ships. Number 7. This is not the language of stylized royal complaint, of the kind we find in temple inscriptions where enemies arrive in uncountable hordes and the gods deliver miraculous victories. 7 is a precise number. It is the number a harbor master would report, or a watchman on a wall. It suggests that someone counted them, stood at some vantage point above the water, and counted the sails or the hulls as they came in. 7 is a real military observation, and it is one of the details that makes RS 18.147 feel different from propaganda. It is the detail of a man writing quickly, from knowledge, not from convention. The city has been burned. Ammurapi uses the past tense, or what reads as the past tense in translation, though the scholars who have worked most closely with the Ugaritic and Akkadian text are careful to note that the grammar here does not allow absolute certainty about the sequence of events. Was the burning already done when he wrote these words? Or is he describing the burning of outlying settlements, while the city itself still stood? Ugaritica 5 and subsequent commentary do not resolve this cleanly, and we will not pretend that they do. What Ammurapi says, in the plainest available translation, is that his cities, the word may be plural, suggesting outlying towns rather than the capital alone, have been burned, and evil things have been done in his country. The fire is present in the letter. Whether it had already reached the scribal quarter where the tablets were kept is a question the letter itself will not answer for us. His troops are in Hatti. His ships are in Lycia. Think about what this means. Ugarit in its final years was still embedded in the obligations of the Hittite imperial system, still sending soldiers north to the armies of the Hittite king, still deploying its fleet in service of a network of alliances and vassal relationships that stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. In the very moment that Ammurapi is writing this letter, the Hittite Empire itself is collapsing. The capital at Hattusa will be abandoned within a generation, if it has not been abandoned already. The armies that Ammurapi has sent north are walking into a world that is itself coming apart. He does not seem to know this, or perhaps he suspects it, and the letter is in part an acknowledgement that the help he once expected from that direction will not come. He has no one to send. The country, he writes, is abandoned to itself. There is no army behind these walls, no fleet in this harbor. And so he does the only thing that remains available to a man in his position. He writes a letter to Cyprus, and he asks, with a directness that 3,000 years have not made any less plain, what he should do. Tell me, he says, if there are more ships coming, so that I can know. And then there is the absence of a reply. This is simply one of the most haunting facts in ancient history, and it requires no embellishment. The letter was found at Ugarit. Whether it was sent or not, no reply survives. Whether the king of Wallachia ever read these words, whether he drafted a response, whether his scribes pressed their styluses into clay and sent back any word of comfort or instruction or warning, all of that is silence. The scholars who catalogued the Ugarit archives found no answering letter. The palace records of Cyprus, such as they are, contain no trace of this exchange. Ammurapi asked his question, and the question has been sitting unanswered for 32 centuries. Yoram Cohen, whose work on the Urtenu archive has illuminated so much of Ugarit's final decades, situates RS 18.147 within a broader pattern of correspondence in which the old networks of obligation and response were already fraying, letters sent without reply, requests for grain and troops that arrived too late or not at all. Seen in that context, the absence of an answer to Ammurapi's letter is not a single cruel silence. It is the last silence in a long sequence of silences, each one slightly longer than the one before, as the connections that had held this world together went quiet, one by one, across the water. The letter itself was found, scholars believe, in or near the royal archive of Ugarit, associated with Ammurapi's own administration rather than the private merchant archives like Urtenu's house. But even here, the excavation context introduces a degree of uncertainty that the most careful scholarship acknowledges honestly. We believe it was Ammurapi's own copy, kept for the record. We cannot be absolutely certain. What we can be certain of is this: the text is real. The clay is real. The number 7 is real. The troops absent in Hatti are real. The ships away in Lycia are real. A man wrote these words in a city on the Syrian coast, sometime around 1185 BC, and no one answered him, and the city did not survive. The letter did. There is something almost impossible to sit with in that fact, that the medium of desperation proved more durable than the thing it was desperate to save. Clay baked in disaster becomes archive. The words that could not summon a fleet became in time the clearest window we have into the last days of a world. Ammurapi could not have known that. He was writing to Cyprus, not to us. He wanted ships, not readers. But here we are, reading his letter in the dark, 32 centuries later. And the 7 ships are still on the water, and the troops are still away in Hatti, and the reply has still not come. There is a temple in the west bank of Thebes that has stood for more than 3,000 years. Its stone walls are thick, its courtyards broad, its carved reliefs still carrying the pigment of their original paint in the sheltered corners where the Egyptian sun has not yet reached. It is called Medinet Habu, and it was built by Ramesses III, who ruled Egypt in the early decades of the 12th century before our era, a king who believed, or at least proclaimed, that he had saved the world. The inscriptions carved into those walls are extraordinary documents. They are not administrative records or private letters. They are official, monumental, intended to be read by the gods as much as by any human eye. Proclamations of divine kingship, rendered in stone so that the victory would be permanent. And among the things they proclaim is something that brings us directly to the question this episode has been circling since its very first chapter. The fall of the kingdoms to the north, and the arrival of peoples moving by land and sea toward the borders of Egypt. The translation we work from here is the authoritative English edition, prepared by William F. Edgerton and John A. Wilson for the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, the historical records of Ramses III, published in the Oriental Institute Studies in Ancient Oriental Civilization, Volume 12. It is available in full through the Internet Archive, and we are going to read from it directly, as the channel always prefers to do when a primary source is close enough to touch. The relevant passage describes what Ramesses says happened before his victories, the condition of the world as he received it, or as he chose to describe it. No land, the inscription declares, could stand before their arms. The kingdoms to the north, and here the text names them, Hatti, Arzawa, Carchemish, Alashia, had been destroyed. Cut off at one time, in the language of the inscription. The peoples, the text continues, came by land and sea, moving as a confederation, burning and destroying as they advanced. Egypt alone, the inscription assures us, held the line. Egypt alone, under the hand of its god-king, turned the tide. This is a magnificent piece of writing. It is also royal propaganda, and it is essential to hold both of those things at once. The document is real. It is datable. Ramesses III's reign is conventionally placed from approximately 1184 to 1153 BC, and the inscriptions describing these events are associated with his 8th regnal year, placing the military encounters they celebrate at roughly 1177 BC. The names of the places it mentions, Hatti, Carchemish, Alashia, correspond to polities we can identify through other evidence. The peoples it names are described with enough specificity, their ships, their ox carts, their families traveling with them, to suggest that whoever composed the inscription was drawing on something more than pure invention. But royal inscriptions in the ancient Near East were not written to record what happened. They were written to proclaim what the gods ordained. Ramesses III was presenting himself in a tradition of divine kingship in which the pharaoh was, by definition, victorious, in which the purpose of monumental text was not testimony but theology. The catastrophe beyond Egypt's borders is described not as a tragedy, but as a stage set, a context for the king's triumph. When the inscription says that no land could stand before their arms, it is setting the scene for the entrance of the one land that could. The term sea peoples itself is not found anywhere in those limestone walls. That is a point worth pausing on. The phrase that has come to dominate the literature on the Bronze Age collapse, the invaders who are cited in documentary after documentary, textbook after textbook, is a modern scholarly construction. It was coined in the 19th century by a French Egyptologist named Emmanuel de Rouget, who used it in 1867 to describe the groups mentioned in earlier 19th dynasty Egyptian inscriptions. The phrase was subsequently applied, retroactively and broadly, to the various groups named in the Medinet Habu texts as well. Ramesses III's inscriptions name them differently: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, group names whose precise origins remain, in most cases, genuinely uncertain. Scholars have proposed identifications for some of these names over the generations. The Peliset are widely associated with the Philistines of the Levantine coast, whose archaeological footprint does appear in the Iron Age record of southern Canaan. The Shekelesh may relate to peoples of Sicily or Anatolia, depending on the scholar and the decade. The Denyen have been connected to the Danans of Greek tradition, or to a group in northern Syria, or to neither. The honest position, which the channel has always preferred to comfortable certainty, is that we do not know with confidence who most of these groups were, where they came from, or whether they constituted anything as coherent as the word confederation implies. The inscription describes them as acting together. Whether they experienced themselves that way is another question entirely, one the inscription is not equipped to answer. What the Medinet Habu texts do give us, and this is their genuine and irreplaceable value, is a near-contemporary Egyptian perspective on a world in crisis. The inscriptions describe the fall of Hatti and Carchemish and Alashia as things that had happened, not threats on the horizon but accomplished facts, already accomplished before the peoples turned south toward Egypt. If we trust the general frame of the inscription, which describes real places falling in a period consistent with what archaeology and the Ugaritic letters suggest, then we are reading a document that registers the collapse of the Bronze Age world as something its neighbors could observe and name, even if they could not explain it. And that is precisely what Ramesses III does not do. He names the groups. He claims the victory. He does not anywhere in those walls explain why the kingdoms to the north fell. He records the catastrophe and claims the credit for halting it. But the cause, the mechanism, the origin, the reason that Hatti and Alashia and Carchemish succumbed while Egypt, for the moment, did not, remains entirely outside the frame of what monumental inscription was built to address. Ramesses was not a historian. He was a god-king writing for eternity. So we have two kinds of sources for these events, and this chapter has been sitting with the distance between them. On one side, the walls of Medinet Habu, grand, durable, confident, written in the language of divine victory, describing a world catastrophe from the outside and from above, with the assured perspective of a power that survived. On the other side, the letters of Ugarit, small, fragile, written on clay in a language that was already losing its scribes, describing the same crisis from inside it, in the urgent and particular voice of people who did not know how the story would end. Ramesses III looks north and sees peoples in motion, kingdoms fallen, a threat repelled. Ammurapi looks out from his burning city and sees 7 ships and absent troops, and a letter going unanswered. Both documents are real. Both are partial. Neither tells us what caused the world to come apart at the seams around 1200 BC, because neither writer had that vantage point. The Medinet Habu inscriptions describe a world in crisis from the Egyptian shore looking northward. The letters from Ugarit look at the same crisis from inside it. Between those two gazes, one triumphant, carved in stone for eternity, the other desperate, pressed into clay and never sent, lies the shape of something we are still trying to understand. Not a single clean cause. Not a single decisive wave of destruction. But a world under pressure, losing its connections, watching its certainties dissolve, writing letters and carving walls as though the words themselves might hold the thing together. They could not. But the words, at least, survived. Chapter 7. What Archaeology Promised and What It Found. There is a particular kind of story that science tells about itself, not about the past it studies, but about the long, patient effort of coming to understand it. The Bronze Age collapse has such a story. It is a story of mud and brushes and careful notebooks, of scholars working in summer heat at the edges of ancient mounds, of discoveries that seemed, at first, to speak for themselves. It is a story worth telling slowly, because the way the catastrophe narrative was built shapes everything that came after it, including the questions that have only recently begun to be asked. Ugarit was not found by a scholar. It was found by a plow. In the spring of 1928, a Syrian farmer working a coastal field near the port town of Latakia, on the northwestern shore of what is now Syria, struck something buried in the earth. His plow had caught the edge of a stone-built tomb, a corbelled chamber of a kind characteristic of the late Bronze Age. And when the soil was cleared away, the objects inside made clear that something old and significant lay beneath this ordinary agricultural field. Word reached the relevant French authorities, who held the archaeological mandate for Syria under the League of Nations, and within the year, a team from the French Academy had arrived to begin excavations. The site was called Ras Shamra, in Arabic, the Hill of Fennel, and it rose gently from the coastal plain, barely a kilometer from the sea. It did not look from the surface like one of the great cities of the ancient world, but cities that have been inhabited for a very long time have a way of building up, gradually, into hills of their own making, each generation building on top of the last, compressing earlier lives into stratigraphy that archaeologists can read, with patience, like the rings of a tree. What the French excavators found at Ras Shamra was exactly this. A mound of accumulated human habitation stretching back to the Neolithic period, through the Chalcolithic and the early and middle Bronze Ages, and then, at the very top, the remains of a prosperous, literate, cosmopolitan city of the Late Bronze Age. That topmost level told a dramatic story. Burned rooms, collapsed walls, abandoned houses with their contents still inside, oil jars, tools, tablets left where they lay. It had the unmistakable quality of interruption. Not a city that declined and was gradually emptied, but a city that had simply stopped. The French excavators, led initially by Claude Schaeffer and then by a succession of French and later French-Syrian teams, documented this destruction layer with care. Schaeffer published his findings systematically, and the image that emerged was both striking and, on its own terms, well evidenced. Here was a city that had burned, sometime in the final decades of the 12th century BC, and was never rebuilt. This was the foundation stone. And in the decades that followed, similar stones were laid at sites across the eastern Mediterranean. At Mycenae and Tiryns in the Greek Peloponnese, excavators found destruction layers at roughly the same horizon. Burned palatial complexes, linear B archives that ended abruptly, signs of violence and abandonment. At Hazor in northern Canaan, one of the great urban centers of the Late Bronze Age, a thick destruction layer was found at the relevant level, the city's Canaanite occupation ending in fire. At Megiddo, another major Canaanite city, the picture was similar. At Enkomi and other sites on Cyprus, the island that had played such a central role in the Late Bronze Age copper trade, destruction and abandonment were documented at the same broad horizon. Each new excavation, it seemed, produced the same result. Each new result was added to the growing list. By the mid-20th century, the list was long enough to have acquired its own weight. The scholarly consensus that formed around it was, in retrospect, entirely understandable. When you stand in the sun at the edge of a trench and see a burned ceiling beam lying at the same angle it fell 3,200 years ago, and when you know that at 50 other sites archaeologists have seen the same thing, the conclusion that imposes itself is powerful. Something very large happened here, all at once, across a very wide area. The Bronze Age collapse began to be spoken of and written about as though it were almost a physical event, a wave, a catastrophe of geological proportion, sudden and total, requiring a cause equal to its apparent scale. The archaeologists doing this work were not careless. Claude Schaeffer was a meticulous excavator. The scholars who documented the destruction layers at Mycenae, at Hazor, at Enkomi, were trained professionals working within the best methodological frameworks available to them. The destruction layers they found were real. This point is worth holding on to, because what comes later in this story is not an accusation. It is something more interesting and more honest than that. What happened, over the course of a century of accumulating evidence, was something that happens in many fields of inquiry. A narrative formed early, was compelling enough to attract wide agreement, and then became the frame through which new evidence was read. The assumption that all these destructions were simultaneous, that they formed a single event rather than a pattern of separate events that merely shared a broad chronological neighborhood, was built into the interpretive framework almost from the beginning. The assumption that they were causally related, that the same force that burned Ugarit also burned Mycenae, was similarly embedded before the radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis required to test it had been applied with anything like consistency. These were not foolish assumptions. In the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, the tools to test them rigorously did not yet exist in their modern forms. Radiocarbon dating was not available to archaeologists until the late 1940s, and its precision for the Late Bronze Age horizon has only improved significantly in recent decades. The comparative stratigraphic methods that would allow scholars to ask hard questions about whether destruction layers at different sites really were contemporaneous were still being developed. The catastrophe narrative was built from what the evidence looked like, and what it looked like was a wave. And so the catastrophe narrative had the field almost entirely to itself for most of the 20th century. Books were written, lectures were given, and the Bronze Age collapse settled into the vocabulary of ancient history as an established fact with an accepted shape, sudden, total, and civilization ending. The question scholars asked was not whether the collapse had occurred as described, but why. The hunt for a cause proceeded on the assumption that the effect was already fully understood. This was not quite true. But the scholarship that would show it was not quite true was still decades away, still waiting in the strata of unasked questions, the way a buried tablet waits for a plow. There is a particular kind of courage required to go back to the beginning, not to find new evidence in the ground, though that too demands its own patience, but to return to the reports already written, the photographs already taken, the destruction layers already named and dated and built upon by generations of subsequent scholarship, and to ask, quietly and without drama, is this actually what the record says? That is what Jesse Millick did. His book, published in 2023 by Lockwood Press under the title Destruction and Its Impact on Ancient Societies at the End of the Bronze Age, reviewed that December by Guy D. Middleton in the journal Antiquity, represents something that is rarer in scholarship than it should be. A systematic, methodical return to the original sources underlying a consensus that had been repeating itself with growing confidence for the better part of 100 years. The consensus Millick returned to was the evidentiary foundation of the catastrophe narrative itself. Not the ideas built upon it, the theories about sea peoples and drought and systems collapse, but the raw empirical claim that sits beneath all of them, that around 1200 BC, 148 sites across the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean show evidence of destruction. Burned buildings, abandoned palaces, violent endings. These 148 events, accumulated across decades of excavation reports from Greece to Syria, Cyprus to the Levantine coast, form the ground floor of almost every serious account of the Bronze Age collapse written since the mid-20th century. Millick went back to the original excavation reports underlying each of those 148 claimed events. He read the field notes, the site photographs, the stratigraphic analyses, the careful and sometimes less than careful descriptions left by the archaeologists who had first put their trowels into those soils. And what he found, working through those original reports with methodical patience, was that 94 of those 148 events, 61%, were misdated, assumed without direct evidence, or simply had no destruction layer to speak of in the original excavation record at all. 61%. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment, the way you might sit with an unexpected sentence in an old letter before reading on. 61% is not a rounding error. It is not the kind of marginal revision that scholars make in footnotes without disturbing the main argument. If Millick's analysis holds, and Middleton's review in Antiquity treats it as serious, careful work deserving of genuine engagement, then the picture of simultaneous, widespread catastrophic destruction that has anchored Bronze Age collapse scholarship for a century is not a picture drawn from the ground. It is, in substantial part, a picture drawn from the accumulation of scholarly assumptions, layered on top of one another with quiet confidence, each generation inheriting the conclusions of the last and adding its own interpretation on top, until the inherited story came to feel as solid as the stones it purported to describe. This is how scholarly consensus can quietly outrun its own evidence, not through fraud or carelessness, but through the perfectly human tendency to read the past through the frame you have already been given. An excavator in 1950, finding an ash layer at a site in the Argolid, knew the story of the Bronze Age collapse. They had been trained in it. The ash layer fit. It was recorded as a destruction event and entered the literature. The excavator who came later cited that destruction event, and the scholar after that cited both, and so the edifice rose. Not dishonestly, but each story built partly upon the stories that came before it, rather than purely upon the soil. Middleton's review in Antiquity is careful to note the significance of Millick's contribution, while also acknowledging that some aspects of his analysis will invite scholarly debate, as any revisionist work of this scope inevitably does. This is the normal and healthy metabolism of academic life. But the central finding, that a substantial fraction of the destruction events underlying the catastrophe narrative are evidentiary thin ice, stands as a challenge that the field will need to address seriously. Now, it is important to be precise about what Millick's work does and does not claim, because precision is the only fair way to engage with scholarship of this kind. Millick does not argue that the Bronze Age collapse did not happen. He does not propose that the world of Ugarit and Mycenae simply continued unchanged into the Iron Age while scholars invented a disaster that never occurred. The collapse is real. Its broad contours are real. Ugarit is still an abandoned city. The palace at Mycenae, whatever violence or dissolution it experienced, still stops functioning in these years. The Linear B archive, those careful clay records of palace inventories, land grants, and religious offerings maintained by Mycenaean scribes, still falls silent in the late 13th century, the writing system itself disappearing from the record for several centuries until the Greek alphabet begins its own long life. The Egyptian empire still contracts. The Hittite state, which had been one of the great powers of the ancient world for centuries, still ceases to exist as a recognizable political entity. Something ended. Something real and large and consequential. What Millick's work challenges is not the reality of that ending, but the precision of its described shape, the simultaneity, the sense that destruction swept across the eastern Mediterranean like a single wave in a compressed band of time, is not as archaeologically secure as the dominant story has implied. The totality, the picture of every major Bronze Age center consumed in catastrophe, is, in the excavation record, demonstrably overstated. The single cause narrative, which has always been more of a scholarly temptation than a proved conclusion, but which the weight of accumulated destruction events seem to demand, becomes considerably less compelling when 61% of those events are removed from the scaffolding. What remains, when you hold the evidence more carefully, is a picture that is patchier, more uneven. Some sites burned, others were abandoned without fire, others declined gradually over decades. Still others continued functioning into the Iron Age with less disruption than the standard narrative suggests. The destruction was real in some places, probable in others, and apparently assumed rather than observed in a substantial number of sites that have been repeating themselves in the literature as established data points for generations. The narrator of a history channel, sitting with these findings in the quiet of late evening, finds them not discouraging, but genuinely interesting. There is something almost liberating in the revision. The apocalyptic version of the Bronze Age collapse, simultaneous, total, cataclysmic, has always had a slightly unreal quality to it, the quality of a story that has been told so many times it has begun to sound like myth. The patchy, slower, unevenly distributed version that emerges when the evidence is read more carefully sounds, by contrast, like history. It sounds like the kind of ending that actual human civilizations experience, not all at once, not everywhere equally, not for a single clean reason, but through the accumulation of pressures, the fraying of connections, the slow failure of systems that had once seemed capable of absorbing almost anything. If the catastrophe was smaller and slower and more localized than we thought, then the real story of what ended the Bronze Age world is not a story about a wave. It is a story about the spaces between waves, about the merchants who kept writing letters into a system that was already quietly failing, the scribes who maintained their tablets while the trade routes that gave those tablets meaning were going dark one by one, the kings who sent for grain and soldiers and help from networks that were no longer as robust as they had been. It is a story about the very particular human experience of living inside a dissolution that has not yet announced itself as final. And that story, honestly told, with all its uncertainty held openly and without apology, is stranger and more human and, in its quiet way, more haunting than the apocalyptic version has ever managed to be. The apocalypse ends in fire, which is at least dramatic. The dissolution that Millick's revised picture suggests ends in unanswered letters, and those in the small hours of the night are harder to put down. There is a particular kind of intellectual honesty that becomes possible only after you have given up the need for a single answer. The previous chapter sat with the uncomfortable finding that 61% of the destruction events underpinning the catastrophe narrative may not have happened when, or how, or sometimes even whether, scholars had long believed. That finding does not dissolve the mystery, it reframes it. And once the frame has shifted, once the idea of a single, simultaneous, total collapse has been loosened from the evidence, the theories that sought to explain that collapse become, in a certain light, more interesting rather than less. Not because they are now free of scrutiny, but because they can be examined for what they genuinely illuminate rather than for what they might ultimately prove. So let us take them in turn, each one in candlelight, and look at what it can see and what it cannot. The oldest and most enduring of the theories, the one that has shaped popular imagination more than any other, is the Sea People's hypothesis. Its foundations rest most heavily on the inscriptions carved into the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet, Habu. Those great limestone texts, translated in full by Edgerton and Wilson for the Oriental Institute, in which the pharaoh describes a world in upheaval and a wave of peoples moving by land and sea from the north. No land could stand before their arms, the inscription reads, and it lists among those who came the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and others. Alongside Medinet Habu, a small number of documents from Ugarit, including most directly Ammurapi's own letter describing ships offshore and a burning city, lend the hypothesis its Levantine texture. The narrative that assembled around these sources across the 19th and 20th centuries was vivid and satisfying. A great migration of warrior peoples, displaced by some earlier crisis further west, swept down through Anatolia and the Aegean, destroyed the Hittite Empire, burned the cities of the Syrian coast, and were finally stopped at the gates of Egypt by Ramesses III, who recorded his triumph in stone. The explanatory appeal of this story is real. There were peoples moving. The inscriptions are genuine. Ammurapi's letter is genuine. The problem lies in what the hypothesis asks those sources to carry. We cannot, with any confidence, identify who the Sea Peoples were or where they came from. The names in Ramesses' inscriptions, Peliset, Checker, Shekelesh, have been variously linked by scholars to the Philistines, to Aegean islanders, to groups in Anatolia and Sicily and Sardinia, but none of these identifications is secure. More fundamentally, the hypothesis assumes that palace economies stretching from Mycenae to Ugarit, separated by hundreds of miles of sea and mountain, were all equally and simultaneously vulnerable to a single wave of migration. It does not explain why earlier migrations and raids, which were a recurring feature of Bronze Age life, had not produced comparable collapse. And it relies, in large part, on the testimony of a pharaoh who had every reason to describe the scale of the threat he had faced as enormous, because the scale of his victory depended upon it. Ramesses III was writing triumph. He was not writing a dispassionate account. The drought hypothesis rests on a different kind of evidence entirely, and in some ways a quieter kind. Paleoclimatic data recovered from lake sediments and pollen cores in the eastern Mediterranean. Evidence gathered not from stone inscriptions or clay tablets, but from the slow accumulation of organic material in still water over thousands of years, shows a real and measurable period of reduced rainfall in the region, centered roughly on 1200 to 1150 BC. The signal is there in the sediments. It is not invented. The scholarship supporting it is careful and serious, and the possibility that a prolonged drought stressed the agricultural base of the palace economies, particularly those, like the Hittite heartland, that depended on grain supplies from the Levantine coast, is entirely plausible. The hunger letters in Urtenu's archive, analyzed by Yoram Cohen, describe real and desperate food shortages in Ugarit's final years, and those letters fit the climatic data more comfortably than they fit the image of a single military onslaught. But the drought hypothesis, too, has its limits. The paleoclimatic evidence is geographically uneven. The signal is stronger in some parts of the eastern Mediterranean than others, and it is not consistently synchronized with the destruction events, such as they are after Millick's revision, that have been documented at individual sites. Droughts had occurred before in the Bronze Age world, and the palace economies had absorbed them. A drought alone cannot easily explain why the redistributive and diplomatic systems that had managed scarcity for centuries should have failed so comprehensively at this particular moment. The earthquake hypothesis, associated most prominently with the geologist Amos Noor and his work identifying seismic destruction layers at sites including Mycenae, Tiryns, and others across the Aegean and Levant, offers something appealing to those who prefer their causes to be geological rather than human. The evidence at specific sites is real, burned and collapsed structures whose destruction patterns are consistent with seismic events rather than military attack. The eastern Mediterranean is, and has always been, a seismically active region, and earthquakes that could reduce a Bronze Age palace to rubble were and remain a genuine hazard of the landscape. The difficulty is one of proportion. Earthquakes struck the Bronze Age world before 1200 BC, and they struck it after, and in neither case did they produce the dissolution of palace civilization across the entire region. A seismic event can destroy a building. It cannot, by itself, dissolve a diplomatic network, interrupt a grain supply system, or cause the linear B script to disappear from the archaeological record. To explain why this particular cluster of earthquakes, if that is what the evidence shows, should have had consequences so far exceeding those of earlier seismic events, the hypothesis needs something else: a prior weakening of the system, a reduced capacity for recovery, a brittleness that earlier centuries had not possessed. And at that point, the earthquake hypothesis begins to dissolve into another theory entirely. That theory is the systems collapse model, and it is most accessibly and thoroughly argued in Eric Klein's widely read synthesis, published under the title 1177 BC, in which he draws on the full range of archaeological and textual evidence to argue that the Bronze Age world was destroyed not by any single cause but by the simultaneous arrival of multiple stresses upon a system that had become, precisely because of its interconnectedness, unusually brittle. The grain networks, the copper routes, the diplomatic correspondence, the palace economies that could not feed themselves without imports, all of it had created a world of remarkable reach and sophistication that was also, beneath its surface, a world of deep mutual dependency. When drought reduced harvests, when migrations disrupted trade routes, when earthquakes damaged port facilities, when internal unrest weakened palace authority, when these stresses arrived not one at a time, but in overlapping waves, the system failed not piece by piece, but in something more like a cascade. The failure of one node weakened the nodes that depended on it, which weakened the nodes that depended on those, faster than the diplomatic machinery of the age could respond. The narrator gives this model its genuine due. It fits the texture of the evidence more comfortably than any of its rivals. It accommodates the drought data and the seismic layers and the hunger letters and Ammurapi's absent troops and the silence that follows his unanswered letter, without requiring any of them to carry the full explanatory weight alone. It is, of the available frameworks, the most intellectually honest in its acknowledgement of complexity. And yet it, too, has a limit that is worth naming clearly. Systems collapse is, in an important sense, a metaphor as much as a mechanism. It borrows its logic from network theory and complexity science, fields that did not exist when the Bronze Age ended, and applies that logic, retrospectively, to a world whose interconnections we understand only partially and whose precise failure sequences we cannot trace with any granularity. To say that the system collapsed because it was complex and stressed is, in a certain light, to say that it fell because the conditions for falling were present. That is not wrong, but it is also not quite an explanation. It is a frame, a very good frame, one that fits the available evidence more honestly than its predecessors, but a frame nonetheless. What current scholarship holds, then, is this: multiple causes, operating across different timescales and with different intensities in different places, weakened the palace civilizations of the Late Bronze Age in ways that were already visible in the desperate correspondence of Ugarit's final years. No single cause is adequate. No single theory carries the evidence without remainder. The Sea Peoples existed in some form and were real, but they were not alone and perhaps not even primary. The drought was real but uneven. The earthquakes were real but insufficient on their own. The system was genuinely interconnected and genuinely brittle. All of this is true simultaneously, and none of it is yet a complete answer. That is not a failure of scholarship. It is a description of where honest scholarship currently stands, and it is a position that the evidence actually supports. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is, in the most precise sense available to us, genuinely not yet finished being told. There are tablets in Urtenu's archive that have not been fully published. There are excavations at Ras Shamra and a dozen other sites still in progress. There are lake sediments still being cored and pollen records still being read. The question remains open, not because scholars have been careless, but because the past is genuinely difficult, and because the most careful recent work has had the intellectual courage to say so. In the meantime, we sit with what we have, a set of theories that each illuminate something real, each cast shadows they cannot account for, and together paint a picture that is less dramatic and more honest than the single-cause catastrophe the last century preferred. That is, in its quiet way, enough to rest with. There is a particular kind of tragedy that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a roar or a flash. It arrives in the ordinary texture of days, in letters sent and not replied to, in ships expected and not seen, in the slow dimming of a light so familiar that no one thinks to remark on its going until the room is already dark. We have spent this episode moving carefully through the evidence. The tablets of Urtenu's archive still waiting on their shelves, the hunger letters asking for grain quickly, quickly, the undelivered plea of Ammurapi to a king who never answered. We have sat with Milik's patient dismantling of the catastrophe narrative, and with the honest acknowledgement that the shape of what ended around 1200 BC is stranger and less dramatic than a century of scholarship had allowed us to believe. All of that was preparation for this moment. Here, at Chapter 10 of 13, is the synthesis the episode has been building toward, and it belongs, as far as this narrator can determine, to no single source in our reading list. If Milik is right that the destruction was patchier and less simultaneous than the dominant narrative assumed, if 61% of the claimed destruction events rest on foundations of misdating and inference rather than excavated evidence, then we must revise not just our casualty list, but our entire picture of what the ending looked like from the inside. And if the Urtenu archive is right that Ugarit's final years were characterized not by sudden catastrophe but by hunger, anxiety, and a gradual slowing of the correspondence networks that had defined the Bronze Age world, then what those last letters describe is something quite specific and quite human. The experience of living inside a system that was already dissolving, written by people who had not yet understood that dissolution for what it was. Read in this light Ammurapi's letter, RS 18-147, the tablet found at Ugarit itself, addressed to the king of Alashia and never delivered, changes its meaning. We have read it before in this episode, and we return to it now with different eyes. Ammurapi describes enemy ships, a burning city, troops absent in Hatti, his own fleet away in Lycia. He asks what he should do. That question, sitting in its dried clay for 3,000 years, has always read as a cry from the edge of an abyss. But consider it again. He wrote the letter. He sealed it. He addressed it to a specific king on a specific island and expected that a reply would come. He did not write as a man who believed the system had ended. He wrote as a man who still believed the system worked. He still believed that a letter to Cyprus would produce a response. He still believed that the Hittite armies, absent in the north, would eventually come home. He still believed that ships would arrive. That is not the voice of a man watching his world end. That is the voice of a man waiting for his world to resume. And here is where the real tragedy lives. Not in the fire, though fire was real, and fear was real, and famine before the fire was real. The tragedy is that the world ended slowly enough for people to keep writing letters, slowly enough for merchants to keep tallying their tin and their bronze, slowly enough for scribes to keep training in the cuneiform script that their pupils would, as it turned out, never use, slowly enough for Urtenu to keep his correspondence in careful order on an upper floor that he fully intended to return to. The system did not fail all at once. It failed gradually, and the people inside it kept behaving as though it had not, right up until the point when the letters simply stopped being answered. This is the reframing that the evidence quietly suggests, that the Bronze Age collapse might be most honestly understood not as a catastrophe, but as the gradual dissolution of a communication network. Not cities exploding in a single terrible season, but connections fraying over decades. Trade routes going quiet one by one, diplomatic correspondence thinning out as kingdoms that had once replied now could not or did not. Scribal schools losing their students as the palaces that had funded them lost their reason to exist. The palace economies of the late Bronze Age were not just political entities. They were nodes in a network. And what they exchanged, grain, copper, tin, timber, oil, and above all correspondence, was the substance that held the network together. When the correspondence slowed, the network weakened. When the network weakened, the correspondence slowed further. These things reinforce one another in a spiral that looks, from a great enough distance, like a sudden collapse, but which from the inside looked like a long, bewildering quiet. The silence of the archives in this reading is not the echo of fire. It is the sound of a world that stopped writing to itself, slowly at first, unevenly, in ways that the people inside it might have explained away as temporary delays, as seasonal difficulties, as troubles that a well-placed letter or a timely shipment of grain might yet resolve. And then, all at once. This does not diminish the human cost of what happened. Yoram Cohen's hunger letters are not metaphors. The people asking for grain quickly were genuinely hungry, and some of them, in all likelihood, did not survive the years they were riding through. The disruption of the trade networks that had fed palace populations across the eastern Mediterranean meant real privation on a scale that the archaeological record, however patchily, does reflect. The famine was real. The displacement was real. The cities that went dark went genuinely dark, and the people who had lived in them did not simply move elsewhere and carry on unchanged. But what we understand about that darkness changes when we stop looking for a single catastrophic match and start looking instead at the long, slow drying of the tinder. The system that produced the Bronze Age world, its palace economies, its long-distance correspondence, its multilingual scribal traditions, its assumption that the ships would always come, was not struck down. It was gradually starved of the exchange that had given it life, until the exchange stopped, and then the system stopped, and the palaces that had no function found no reason to rebuild. There is a small detail from the Urtenu archive that the narrator wants to linger on before this chapter closes. Urtenu kept his correspondence in order, not in chaos, not scattered in panic, but arranged, thematically grouped, as the excavation record suggests, in a manner that implies a man who expected to use those letters again. He was a senior official and a merchant in the final years of a city that was, by the evidence of its own documents, experiencing hunger, anxiety, and the fraying of the networks it depended on. He knew things were difficult. The letters make that plain, and yet he kept his files in order. He behaved, right to the end, as a man who expected the system to recover, who expected that the letters would be read, the grain would arrive, the ships would come back into harbor. That is, in its quiet way, one of the most poignant things the Bronze Age has left us. Not the fire that baked the tablets, not the dramatic absence of Ammurapi's reply, but the orderly shelves of a man who did not know he was living at the end of something, because the end came slowly enough to look, from the inside, like a difficulty rather than a dissolution. The last letters of Ugarit are not dispatches from the edge of an abyss. They are the ordinary correspondence of people living through decades of tightening strain, written in the confident forms of a diplomatic and commercial tradition that had functioned for centuries and that they had every reason to believe would function still. The tragedy is not that they were wrong about the fire. The tragedy is that they were right about the system, right that it had worked, right that it was the kind of thing that could in principle be saved, but that by the time the letters stopped, the system had already dissolved around them without anyone having issued a formal announcement of its end. Somewhere in that slow dissolution, between the last grain shipment and the last unanswered letter, between the shelf Urtenu arranged and the shelf the archaeologists found, is the real story of the Bronze Age collapse. It is quieter than the story we prefer. It is more human. And it is, in the most honest reading of the evidence available to us, closer to what actually happened. History has a way of surviving the stories we tell about its endings. The world of the late Bronze Age did not leave behind a clean ruin. It left behind continuations, frayed, transformed, sometimes barely recognizable, but real. And to tell the story of Ugarit honestly requires sitting with both things at once: the genuine disruption of those decades around 1200 BC, and the equally genuine fact that a great deal of what the Bronze Age world had built, learned, and inscribed into the fabric of daily life did not simply vanish when the letters stopped. Begin with the cities of the Levantine coast: Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, the great Phoenician ports that had traded alongside Ugarit for centuries. Continued after the collapse, and in the Iron Age centuries that followed, they did not merely survive, but found new purposes and new reach. The trading traditions of the Bronze Age world, the careful accounting of cargo, the management of sea routes, the art of dealing simultaneously with many different kingdoms and peoples. These were practices that the Phoenician cities carried forward and elaborated. Where Ugarit had been one node in a palace-centered network, the Phoenician traders of the early first millennium BC would become something more independent, merchants operating across a Mediterranean that no longer had a single dominant palace system at its center, establishing trading posts and, eventually, settlements as far west as the coast of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. The Bronze Age world system, in this light, did not die without descendants. It dissolved, and some of what it knew was gathered up and carried further than it had ever reached before. But there is something even closer to Ugarit that survived, something the city contributed to the world without ever knowing the full weight of what it was giving: the alphabetic script. Ugarit's scribes had worked in cuneiform, pressing wedge-shaped signs into clay, and the Ugaritic alphabet was itself one of several alphabetic and proto-alphabetic writing systems developing along the Levantine coast during the late Bronze Age. Those systems, and the traditions of teaching, copying, and preserving them that went with them, did not disappear when the palace economies that housed their scribal schools fell silent. The Phoenician alphabet of the early Iron Age descended from this same family of writing, and from the Phoenician alphabet came the Aramaic, the Hebrew, the Greek, the Latin, and ultimately, through centuries of slow transformation and transmission, every alphabetic writing system in use in the world today. The letters you are hearing read aloud now, the sounds being shaped by a voice and received by your listening ear, descend, in a long and winding line, from the scribal traditions of the very cities whose tablets were buried in ash. The child who learned to press signs into clay in a Ugaritic schoolroom in the 13th century BC was learning, without knowing it, a method of recording human thought that would eventually reach every inhabited continent on Earth. That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a fact of cultural transmission that the evidence of archaeology and linguistics supports, traced carefully through the work of generations of scholars. In Egypt, The picture is one of contraction rather than collapse. Ramesses III, whose great temple at Medinet Habu records his battles against the peoples arriving from the sea in the north, continued to reign until approximately 1155 BC. His dynasty did not end with the crisis. It outlasted it by another generation before its own internal decline. A slow unraveling of royal authority, economic pressure, and administrative difficulty that was separate from the Bronze Age collapse proper, though not entirely unconnected to the world it had left behind. The Egyptian empire in Canaan contracted. The tribute networks shortened. But Egypt as a civilization, with its language, its priestly traditions, its monumental architecture, and its bureaucratic memory, continued for more than 1,000 years beyond the reign of Ramesses III. Empires contract. Civilizations prove more durable than any single political form. Further north and west, the picture is more severe. The collapse of the Mycenaean palace systems in Greece was followed by what scholars call the Greek Dark Ages, and the name is not entirely unearned. Population declined in many parts of the Aegean. Long-distance trade contracted sharply. The linear B writing system, which had been used by Mycenaean palace administrators to record inventories and transactions, was lost entirely. The scribal schools that had taught it disappeared along with the palaces that had needed it. For several centuries, the Greek world was largely non-literate in the formal sense. That is a real and significant loss, and it is worth naming it as such without softening. And yet across those same centuries, communities persisted. People continued to farm, to raise animals, to build houses, to bury their dead, to tell stories. The oral traditions that carried memory from one generation to the next did not require clay tablets or palace storerooms. They required only voices and the willingness to listen, not so different in that respect from what you are doing now. The epics that would eventually be attributed to Homer, written down in something like the 8th century BC, drew on memories of a world that had ended centuries before their composition. Bronze-armored warriors, great walled cities, ships crossing the Aegean on campaigns of years. Those memories were transformed by time, shaped by the needs of later audiences, blended with later practices and beliefs. They are not a reliable historical record of the Bronze Age, but they are evidence that the Bronze Age world left a long echo in the cultures that came after it, audible even when the writing had stopped and the palaces had gone to grass. None of this is triumphalist. The continuities described in this chapter were real, but they were slow, they were partial, they were purchased at considerable human cost. The cost of displacement, of hunger, of the loss of the intricate knowledge systems that had allowed a scribe in Ugarit to correspond in 7 languages with traders and kings across the known world. What survived the Bronze Age collapse was not the Bronze Age world. What survived was something new, shaped by different conditions, serving different purposes. Something that had grown from the roots of the older world without being that world any longer. Ugarit itself was never rebuilt. The hill of Ras Shamra was occupied again briefly in the Iron Age, but the city as it had existed, with its palace, its scribal schools, its merchant quarter, its archive rooms full of clay letters, did not return. The particular density of connection and practice and accumulated knowledge that had made Ugarit what it was could not simply be reconstituted in a later century by people living among its stones. What could be carried forward was carried forward. The alphabet, the trade routes, the memory, however distorted, of what had been. These are not nothing. Over the long centuries between the silence of the Bronze Age archives and the world we inhabit now, they became, quietly and without announcement, quite a lot. The story does not end in pure loss, but it does not end in redemption either. It ends, as most honest histories do, in the complicated middle ground where human beings have always lived, between what was lost and what was saved, between the tablets still unread and the letters still, somehow, arriving. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that we can read Ammurapi's letter at all. Think for a moment about what had to happen for that letter to reach us. It was written on clay, pressed into wet mud with a stylus, in a cuneiform script that would be lost to human knowledge for more than 2,000 years. It was written in Ugaritic, a language that required decades of painstaking modern scholarship to decipher. A language that was read for the first time in the modern era only in 1930 by the French scholar Charles Virolode, working from a handful of tablets whose alphabet no living person had seen before. And it survived, this small clay tablet with its careful wedge marks, because it was baked in a fire that was, from the perspective of the man who wrote it, a catastrophe. The same heat that ended Ugarit preserved its last words. There is a quiet irony in that, sitting in the dark now, which the channel feels no need to dramatize. It is enough to simply hold it. Letters are unusual things among the documents of the ancient world, and it is worth pausing on what makes them unusual. The inscriptions carved into the limestone walls of Medinet Habu, which we read in an earlier chapter in the words of Ramesses III, were made to be permanent. They were made to be seen, to declare, to outlast any particular moment. A letter is the opposite of that. A letter is written for one reader, in one moment, with the assumption that the moment will pass and the letter will be filed away or discarded. When Ammurapi pressed his message into clay, he was not speaking to posterity. He was speaking to the king of Wallachia, across the water, with urgency, expecting a reply. The fact that we are the ones who eventually read it is an accident of catastrophe. The fire that preserved the clay was never meant to be a library. This intimacy is what makes ancient letters so precious as historical sources. They record what official inscriptions were never designed to carry: anxiety, urgency, the specific human texture of a moment. The grain letters of the Urtenu archive, those messages asking for shipments to arrive quickly, do not read like royal proclamations. They read like letters from people who were frightened, written to people they hoped might help. The Archaeology magazine feature on the Urtenu archive noted that roughly 130 tablets had been fully published by the time of writing, with up to 100 more still awaiting complete decipherment. Scholars working now in the 21st century are still reading Urtenu's correspondence for the first time. There is something in that detail that is difficult to fully absorb, that the private mail of a Bronze Age merchant is still, in a small and literal sense, being opened. But letters are also partial in ways that their intimacy can obscure. We have the letters that happen to be in the rooms that happen to survive the conditions that happen to preserve clay. That is not a representative sample of ancient correspondence. It is a survival sample, shaped by accident, by the chemistry of soil, by the presence or absence of fire, by whether a building's roof fell in a way that protected the floor below or crushed it entirely. Every letter we can read is a letter that no one came back to collect. The Urtenu archive exists, in part, because Urtenu never returned to his house. If he had, he might have taken the most important letters with him, and left the rest to decay in a way that unfired clay, unprotected from moisture, readily does. Our archive would have been smaller, or different, or nothing at all. And letters are almost always one-sided. The replies, if they came, arrived on tablets that were carried away, put to use, or lost. We have Ammurapi's letter to the king of Wallachia partly because it never left Ugarit. It was found at the site of the city itself, which means it was either never dispatched or perhaps a working draft, though we cannot know for certain, as Yoram Cohen and other scholars note when discussing the document. We do not have the king of Wallachia's answer, if one ever came. We do not know whether the ships Ammurapi begged for were sent, whether they arrived too late, or whether the silence from across the water was simply silence. The Urtenu archive is a partial exception to this one-sidedness, and it is worth understanding why. Because it was a private merchant's collection rather than a palace chancellery record, It preserved incoming correspondence, letters sent to Urtenu, that a state archive might have filed differently or discarded once their immediate business was concluded. A royal archive keeps copies of what was sent outward. A merchant keeps what arrived, because the letters are records of obligations, transactions, relationships. This is why Urtenu's tablets contain letters from Hittite kings and distant correspondence in a way that a purely official archive might not. But even so, even allowing for that relative richness, the Urtenu archive is a fragment of a fragment. It is the correspondence that survived in one room of one house in one city. The full texture of Bronze Age communication, the millions of letters that were written, read, answered, and simply worn away by time, is gone beyond any recovery. This is the moment, if there is one in this episode, to speak honestly about what historical work with this kind of evidence actually looks like. The difference between saying the letters suggest and the letters prove is not a merely technical distinction. It is the difference between a disciplined reading of the past and a wishful one. When scholars say the Urtenu letters suggest a period of severe food shortage in Ugarit's final years, which they do, on the basis of Cohen's analysis of multiple documents describing desperate conditions, that suggest is doing real and important work. It means, here is a pattern in the evidence, a pattern visible enough to name and describe, but not a sealed case. It means, other explanations are possible, even if this one fits best. It means, more tablets may yet be read, and the picture may shift. The same discipline applies to the larger story we have been telling all evening. As we saw when we spent time with Jesse Millick's careful work through original excavation reports, the destruction events that form the empirical basis of the Bronze Age collapse narrative are not as firmly documented as a century of confident retelling has implied. 61% of the claimed destructions around 1200 BC were, in Millick's analysis, misdated, assumed without direct evidence, or simply absent from the original excavation records. That is not a reason to doubt that something ended, or that the ending was real and human and costly. It is a reason to hold the shape of that ending more loosely, to distinguish between the silence of the archive and the silence of the past, which are related but not identical. The archive is silent because the writing stopped. The past was once full of sound. This is not a counsel of despair, sitting here in the quiet hours. If anything, it is the opposite. The partiality of the evidence, held honestly, is what makes ancient history genuinely interesting. More interesting, I would argue, than a clean narrative with a settled conclusion would be. The evidence is real, and it is partial, and it is strange. A merchant's mail sat on a shelf for 3,000 years and is still being read. A king wrote a letter that was never answered, and we have it. A fire that ended a world preserved the words of the man who watched it come. Reading these things carefully, sitting with what they can and cannot tell us, tracing the difference between a pattern and a proof, that is one of the more quietly satisfying things a human mind can do in the dark hours of the night, when the world outside is still and the old clay tablets rest in their cases, holding what they hold. And so we come back, at last, to the shelf. You may remember it from the beginning of the evening. A room on the upper floor of a merchant's house in the city of Ugarit, somewhere on the Syrian coast, in the final years of the late Bronze Age. A man named Urtenu had arranged his correspondence there with the care of someone who expected to return to it. Letters from kings, requests for grain, records of tin and copper moving along the sea lanes of the eastern Mediterranean, all of it stacked and waiting, organized by a hand that knew where everything was. And then, for reasons we still cannot say with certainty, Urtenu did not come back. The tablets sat in the dark for a little over 3,000 years, until the floor above them gave way under its own slow weight and buried them in rubble, where archaeologists found them in 1986, still in rough order, still patient, still waiting. We began there, and we end there, because that shelf is the truest image this episode has to offer. Not a burning city, not a wave of invaders cresting a hill, a shelf of unanswered letters, sitting quietly in the ruins of a house, in the ruins of a world. There is no tidy conclusion to offer tonight, and this channel has never promised one. What we have are the letters themselves. We have Ammurapi's unanswered plea to the king of Wallachia, the enemy ships offshore, the soldiers away in Hatti, the city already burning or about to burn, and the long unclosed silence where the reply should be. We have the hunger letters, with their raw repetitions, grain quickly, quickly, written by people who were frightened and who put that fear into clay because clay was what they had. We have Urtenu's archive, the largest private correspondence collection yet found at Ugarit, still not fully published, still being read in the 21st century by scholars who are, in a very real sense, the first people to hear what those letters have to say. And we have, sitting alongside all of that, the honest acknowledgement that the world which produced these letters ended in ways we do not fully understand. A century of careful excavation and a century of careful argument have not settled the question. The Sea Peoples may have played a role. The evidence is real, but the interpretation is complicated by the fact that our primary source is a pharaoh's victory inscription, which is not a neutral document. The droughts were real. The paleoclimatic data from lake sediments and pollen cores shows a genuine period of reduced rainfall across the eastern Mediterranean, though unevenly distributed and not everywhere synchronized with the destructions. The systems collapse model captures something true about the fragility of interconnected worlds. But a metaphor, however illuminating, is not a mechanism. And Jesse Millick's patient, methodical work through the original excavation reports has reminded us that even the basic architecture of the catastrophe, the widespread simultaneous destruction of cities from Greece to the Levantine coast, is less firmly grounded in the archaeological record than a century of confident retelling has led us to assume. 61% of the claimed destruction events, when traced back to their original sources, were misdated, assumed, or absent from the ground altogether. Something ended. That is not in doubt. But the shape of the ending is quieter, slower, and stranger than the dramatic version we prefer. That quietness, I want to suggest to you, is not a disappointment. It is the story. Because if the ending was slow rather than sudden, if what the last letters of Ugarit describe is not the edge of an abyss, but the experience of living inside a system that was already, gradually, dissolving, then what Ammurapi's letter captures is something more particular and more human than apocalypse. It captures the moment when a man still believed the system worked. He still thought a letter to Cyprus would produce a response. He still expected that the Hittite armies would come home, that the ships would arrive, that the network of correspondence and commerce and mutual obligation that had defined his world for generations would, as it always had, hold. The tragedy of RS 18.147 is not that it describes the end of the world. It is that it was written by someone who did not yet know he was at the end. He wrote the letter. He waited. The reply never came. Somewhere under the hill of Ras Shamra, there are still tablets that have not been read. Urtenu's archive is not yet fully published. Scholars working through the remaining material estimate that up to 100 tablets await their full decipherment, sitting in museum conditions now rather than on a merchant's shelf, but still unread by any living eye. The last letters of the Bronze Age are, in a small and genuinely remarkable sense, still arriving. Whatever Urtenu's correspondents had to say, whatever anxieties they recorded, whatever ships they were watching, whatever grain they were asking for, some of those words are still making their way toward us across the 3,000-year silence, one careful translation at a time. I find that thought a companionable one at this hour of the night. We have spent a long evening together in old company, among merchants and kings and hungry populations and careful scribes, in palaces that do not stand, and cities whose names had to be recovered from the earth. You have been a generous companion across all of it, and I am grateful for your company through the long centuries of this story. It is late now. The candle is burning low, and somewhere in their museum cases, in Damascus, in Paris, in the careful climate-controlled quiet of the institutions that hold them, the old clay letters are resting, as they have rested before and will rest again, holding whatever it was they had to say, patient as they have always been, waiting with a stillness that has by now become something very close to peace. Good night, Ugarit. Good night.